we've done enough preparatory work in the last two, that is to say the first two videos, to begin reading the text in the order that it claims or wants, in a linear order. We'll see that may be slightly more complex than it may seem at first glance, because in fact words don't exactly mean what they seem to mean in Laruelle's text. Remember that we said that there are sort of basically two ways to use language to make sense when you're introducing a radically new paradigm. Either you introduce new terminology that doesn't have any contamination by associations or connotations from the old paradigm, or you use the old words but you give new meanings to them. So in this book, Laruelle doesn't use all that many new terms. I mean, he is noteworthy for his jargon, but in this book there are only a few new terms. So basically he's using familiar terms, especially for those who've done philosophy, but giving them new meanings. And when we say he's giving them new meanings, we must recall what we said about the history of his thought. So what has been acquired in the course of the 70s, his books published in the 70s, and with his breakthrough, as he calls it, his breakthrough book, The Principle of Minority, in 1981, what has been acquired with regards to language is that the language has been subject to a process of radicalization, intensification, transvaluation, and transcendentalization. So anything that you read in this book, you'll have to read in terms of those four operations. So to cut things short and not to repeat the four operations over and over, I'll call that transvaluation. The words have been transvalued, even though we must understand it's more than Nietzschean transvaluation. So, for example, if we take the title, A Biography of Ordinary Man, the preceding book is called Principle of Minority, or Minority Principle, but this book is not called The Principle of Ordinary Man or The Principle of Ordinariness, because principle, once you've radicalized, intensified, transvalued, and transcendentalized, becomes biography. Biography is, as we said, conceptual biography, a transcendental biography, which is to say a description of transcendental experiences of the ordinary man. And we could ask, okay, could you have a biography in that sense of anything else? Or is it just limited to ordinary man? I don't know if Laruelle replies to that anywhere, but I would say, given the underlying pluralism, yes, of course, we can have transcendental biographies of other things. Otherwise, we will be caught in a tautology. The title itself will be a circle, and Laruelle's basic idea is that philosophy is just going round in circles and not getting anywhere radically new. So we've applied this principle of transvaluation. Well, he's applied it first to forming the title. He drops out the word principle, And later in the book he discusses the transformations that must be given to the notion of principle, and he's replaced it with biography, and it's up to us to understand biography in its transvalued sense. So the same thing continues with the beginning of the foreword. I will be translating from the French sometimes, and so there'll be small differences with the published English translation. Some of those differences will be okay. That makes a nice readable text in English, and it's elegantly and correctly done. Sometimes I will be impelled to correct the translation and say there is obviously a mistake, but in this case I'm just correcting it to bring out other latencies in the actual words used in French. So this work is an attempt at a systematic foundation of a discipline which has obviously had sketches or proclamations in the history of thought, rigorous science of man, but distinct, and this is why it's interesting, this is its interest or its risk, distinct both from philosophy and from the sciences of man which derive from philosophy. Okay, that looks fairly straightforward, but we can look at the word systematic. We're not talking about systematic in the ordinary sense. We're talking about systematic in Laruelle sense, in a transcendental sense. So we can look further in the foreword to see what he means by systematic. So systematic foundation, a rigorous science, so the system is rigorous. He talks about the mode de parcours, the type of path through the book, because he talks about two ways of reading the book. So in fact, two pathways. Either you read it in the order of the parts and the theorems with nothing else, or you read it in the order of the parts and the theorems with the more extended explanations and commentaries that go with each theorem. In the published translation, he lists these two pathways with just the theorems, following the theorems, just the theorems, nothing but the theorems, or following the theorems and the commentaries. They translate either way. Its reading should be linear in scare quotes, and follow the order of the parts. The either way is whatever the type of pathway in French. So I'm keeping the word pathway because we get more references to paths later on, and these are elided in English by the English translation. The way they translate it is not erroneous, but it's missing important connotations and I would say conceptual subtensions to give substance to what Laruelle means by system and systematic. So you've got two pathways, and they're both linear. You follow the theorems, or you follow the theorems plus the commentaries, and yet he calls that at the same time following the necessary order of experiences, which are those of every human. So if you're following the experiences And these experiences are transcendental experiences. It's not empirical experience. Laruelle is too sophisticated for that. So you're following the experiences in their own order, which is not necessarily a chronological order. It's not a logical order either, because that's the result of the operation of radicalization, intensification, transvaluation, and transcendentalization. It removes the logical status of the word principle, for example, if you want to reuse it in his paradigm, and he's removing the logical status of all the words. So even theorem is not to be understood in terms of the logical status that the word theorem has in our ordinary understanding. So a comparison with science fiction comes to mind. If anybody has read Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, in the book there's a character, Billy Pilgrim, and he has come unstuck in time, and he experiences his experiences outside chronological order. So he could be going through an experience in 1980 and then be back in the Second World War, or he can experience just before his own death, and so on. So I would argue, I don't know about you, but when I read a book, I've obviously read this in chronological order, but at the same time, my transcendental experience of the book, my conceptual experience of the book, is all over the place, but highly structured nonetheless, I hope. So I think we're all transcendental pilgrims when we read Laruelle's texts, and that comes up again in the second paragraph, which I've already mentioned, where he says that the book just before this, the breakthrough book, The Minority Principle, was a mixed work, and it followed the ways of transcendence, the paths of transcendence, one could say as well. It's a different word. It's no longer parcours, but voie, which may be a little bigger, but it's still a way or a path. In English, it's translated as the means of transcendence, but I think it's important to get this idea of path and following the paths of transcendence. And that's where we begin to get an insight into what the very first line can mean by system. Because the system, the systematic order, is following the order of the theorems, which correspond. But is it a logical one-to-one correspondence? But correspond to the necessary order of experiences. So the order is the order of experiences, and it's not the order of transcendence, the path of transcendence. So the path of transcendence is probably what most of us would think of, without thinking of that expression, when we think of a system. So he claims that a biography of ordinary man is at last systematic, a systematic foundation, and the minority principle is a mixed bag of the old and the new. But by ordinary standards, if you look through or read through as well, the minority principle, it's even more systematic in appearance than a biography of ordinary man. So the notion of system has to be understood in a different way. Obviously, well, we're meant then not to follow the paths of transcendence, but to follow the paths of immanence by implication. Obviously, that's the same paths experienced in a different way, because in fact there's no such thing as the paths of transcendence. If Laruelle is right, we're in immanence, and transcendence is some sort of illusion. To understand then what the system and the order of experience and the paths of immanence comprise, he concludes the second paragraph by saying the book, I think it's the book, strives to reconcile a certain theoretical rigour which is absent from philosophy. So he's saying even the most rigorous systematic philosophy is lacking in rigour. Somehow it's, as we said in the last video, it's careless. It's not fully rational. It seems to be rational, but in fact it's not. And the other part, because we're trying to reconcile two things, the second thing is a certain love of human truth, which is also absent from philosophy. And he seems to suggest, well, he says it's a wager, that these two absences are for the same reason. So the system and the systematic order and the paths of immanence that we as transcendental pilgrims, that is readers, must follow are part of the reconciliation between rigour and humanity, or as he goes on to say, between theory and affect. So as soon as you split the two, you're not in immanence and you're not really systematic, however systematic you seem to be, or convince yourself you are, or convince others that you are. You're not rigorous, and you're not human enough. Okay, so that's the word systematic. Foundation, normally, the book came out in 1985. Laruelle, like the other philosophers that are in his constellation, have gone through the crisis in foundations that came to a head in the beginning of we could say the first half of the 20th century. So the crisis in the foundations of mathematics, the crisis in the foundations of physics with the invention of relativity and quantum theory. In mathematics, Laruelle himself will go back to the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry, and probably he has in mind the paradoxes of set theory and the various movements that tried to find a coherent foundation for mathematics. So he has been through the crisis in foundations. So the foundation can't be a foundation in that sense. Remember, all the words are transvalued. So the word he uses to describe the bad foundation is base or basis. So that's foundation in the ordinary sense, and that belongs, as he says, to the world, with a capital W, which is under the influence of the authorities, or the influence under the Constitution. of the authorities, or the illusory constitution of the authorities, and the foundation in the new sense for Laruelle is the ordinary man, the ordinary human. We've already discussed the idea that before there were sketches and proclamations at best in the history of philosophy. So the rest of the systems of thought that were proposed are sort of wrapping, packaging around the valid sketches and proclamations. But the wrapping, as he's already said, is not human, and it's not rigorous, it's careless, and it's lacking in human affect. So the discipline he's trying to found is a rigorous science of man. So we've talked about rigour. We can talk about the word science. Elsewhere in the book, he takes care to say it's a transcendental science, but here he doesn't. And most of the time he doesn't. And for the rest of his life, most of the time he doesn't. So here we can give him a free pass. We can say he's saying science, and we're meant to read that and react. And say, what? No. François, it's not a science. It's not a science in the ordinary sense. And then we're meant to think, aha, it's a transcendental science. Okay, so there's a provocation, but a good provocation, a noetic provocation. We're meant to transvalue on the spot in reading the word if we want to go on and take Laruelle seriously. I've argued on my blog over and over again, because if Laruelle can repeat himself, so can I, that this is a mistake. A provocation can't last 40 years because he's been doing it for 40 years. Can't be a joke. A 40-year joke is not a joke. Can't be a provocation. Later, he will say, several years later, that in this period he was being scientistic, but now he's understood how to purge himself of the scientific element, and then he will go on using the word science. So not only is he wrong, I think this is an example of what we discussed in the last video about the notion of institutional disgrace. So personally, I don't think only that it's wrong and that Laruelle is making a big mistake to keep the term all these years. It's a strategic mistake, so that's okay. But I think that his Anglophone followers are just in disgrace in that they don't discuss the idea that that's wrong. They translate to Laruelle, they have discussions with Laruelle, and they don't have the guts, because that's it, to say, Laruelle, no, that's wrong, it won't work in English. Maybe in France, because there's a reference to Husserl, and people automatically think of Wissenschaft, and that's not science, but sort of systematic study and so on. But if ever you want to get taken seriously in English, you have to drop the word science. But they don't do it. So I issue a warning when you read and listen to Laruellians that there may be crucial flaws in their approach to Laruelle, but that doesn't invalidate their whole approach, and they say useful things. But I think this may be a pet peeve, I don't know, but I think that the use of the word science for the moment is good. It makes you react, it makes you see that you have to transvalue these simple words that make up the foreword. But I think that it should not have gone on 40 years, and his followers and disciples and students should have made it clear to him, because they're the minorities and he's the authority. So he should have listened to them, or he would have, if he practices what he preaches. So we'll continue with the actual words of the foreword. So I think I've covered the main content of the foreword. He himself says that he couldn't avoid certain anticipations destined to give an overview and to faire voir, to make visible, as one says today, the stakes. So it's translated, we could not avoid certain preemptions. Preemptions instead of anticipations. I personally don't like it, but I don't see anything wrong with it. Intended to give a view of the whole, instead of an overview. A view of the whole is probably even better. And demonstrate, I would say that that's wrong. Faire voir is to render visible, to give to see, or make seeable, make visible the stakes. So it's to give an overview of the whole and of the stakes, in fact. So he hasn't been able to avoid sketches and proclamations, that is to say, overviews that break up the orderly sequence of the theorems. So we can say that's already the case in the title, and that's already the case in the foreword, which continues to give an overview of his aims, his stakes, and what is to come. So, as I said, when we see the word systematic, we can ask what would it be to be unsystematic? And one type of unsystematicness, unsystematicity, is an example of that, although we'll see later he says he doesn't give examples, but he's charitable at the beginning. So is his book The Principle of Minority. It's unsystematic because it's a mixture of the old and the new, of the paths of transcendence and the paths of immanence. So that, given that he's claiming to be a science, we can look at it from that point of view and say this is a phenomenon that is well known in the history of science, in the history of radical paradigm changes. So often you'll have a new paradigm set out in an unsystematic way, and it will take time to articulate the system in its own terms. In the transitional period, its terms or its meanings will be in a state of mixture with the old terms and meanings. So a couple of examples of that are with relativity, the actual equations of Einstein's relativity existed before his theory. They were the Lorentz Fitzgerald equations, but they were interpreted in terms of the old theory. They were interpreted as contractions, physical contractions, and slowing down of light produced by the ether. And so somehow we got to the equations, but we still had the old meanings, and Einstein came along and gave the new meanings to them. And then we were ready to think entirely in the new terms. A second example is quantum theory, where once the notion of quantization of the atom was introduced, Niels Bohr and his circle put up a transitional theory of the atom, which was a mixture of classical and quantum principles, until the Heisenberg matrices and the Schrödinger wave equation came along, and it could be interpreted without, totally in quantum theoretical terms, without admixture of classical hypotheses. So what Laruelle is saying is that now, in this book, 1985, 4 years after his breakthrough, he's in a position to express things in systematic form, that is to say, with language systematically equipped with the new meanings of the new paradigm. So this explains part of the initial strangeness of the book, because we're asked to think in terms of the new language, the new meanings, straight away. So that again is something that comes up in philosophy of science. It has been argued that once you get to a certain level of formalization in the education and induction into physics, for example, so let's say at the end of high school or the beginning of university, it makes more sense to begin your study of mass and velocity and time in terms of relativity, and then later on introduce the classical conceptions as a special case, as a approximation with low velocities relative to the velocity of light, for example. And that is, it is suggested, easier to understand than to start off with the formalization of the classical conceptions and then say, no, all that's wrong, and these are the new conceptions. So Laruelle is doing much the same thing. This is the purity of the book and its language. This is the laboratory aspect. He's in his conceptual laboratory. He's pushing the terms as far as he can go, and we're meant to either have an idea of what he's doing because we've read all his other books, or some of them. But that's not necessary. We can just take the leap and jump in and go with this way of thinking and with the new meanings that are attached or attributed to the familiar words. So he goes on to consider flaws that belong to this type of enterprise. So one of the flaws is that the breakthrough has to be made twice, once in impure form and once in pure form. And in the pure form, when we're reading it, we will probably, almost certainly, go through the mixed state anyhow, even if he's writing in the purified language. We will be constantly trying to get a grip on the language. Some things will be clear and obvious to us straight away, otherwise we probably would be continuing to read the book, and others will pose a problem until we can convert our conceptual gaze to this new way of seeing. But there are other flaws that, so that's a necessary. So I would say that's already part of the necessary order of experiences. It's a transcendental flaw. It goes with the game, if you want. Goes with the operation of transvaluation. So the flaws that he says are inherent and so inevitable, he considers at the beginning they seem to be personalistic flaws, and some of them he will endorse and transvalue, and the others maybe not. So the flaws are naivete, and naive statements. So he's going to talk about the necessary for a naive language, a naive thought in terms of a transcendental naivete. So this naivete that you have to go through will be partially the naivete of the empirical world, because you have not yet been fully inducted into Laruelle's new paradigm, but it will also be a naivete that is inherent to the paradigm itself. So after he, in English it says empty agendas, that's very close to what the first paragraph at the beginning of the first paragraph calls the hints and signals in English, the sketches and the proclamations, translating from the French. The empty agendas, it's not exactly a mistake, but it says the programme non rempli. So remplir can mean to fill up, and in that case, if the program hasn't been filled up, the program is empty. I agree, but remplir in relation to words like program means satisfied or carried out. So they're not empty agendas in the sense of having nothing in them. They're agendas that are empty, or programs that are empty in the sense that they remain in the state of promissory notes and haven't been carried out. Laruelle says he's done his best to cover, sometimes too succinctly, the principal domains and the essential modes of description. So he's saying he's done the best he can to avoid this problem of programmatic statements that are never fulfilled. He talks about aggressive declarations of intention. So they translate it as aggressive declarations. It's true. Maybe the intention is not necessary. Although maybe it goes along with the idea of the empty agendas. There are aggressive declarations of the intention to do something, for example, that the others couldn't. So they're aggressive. And that comes to a point often you'll hear Laruellians say, "Oh, Laruelle is not against philosophy. He's just doing something else alongside philosophy, but he's got nothing against philosophy." That's obviously wrong. Over and over again, Laruelle says philosophy tries to get to, aims at immanence, and fails all the time, and just goes around in circles and doesn't get to the real, whereas he does. So that's maybe an aggressive declaration, and it is there all over the place. But maybe he's saying we shouldn't take that too seriously, although he says it for 40 years. So another thing that maybe we're not meant to take seriously, although he does it over and over again. And the many Laruellians just shut their eyes and says, no, he doesn't criticize philosophy at all. But I think he means it, but in a complex way, because he's not really anti-philosophy in the sense of anti-philosophical concepts, but he's anti the enclosure of concepts within these solipsistic circles, the so-called systems, and he wants to free the concepts, and so he wants to keep the concepts and keep his passion for philosophy, his passion for concepts, without allowing them to be enclosed by the experts. Another inevitable fault is the serial refusals, the successive refusals destined to cordon off a territory. Okay, so we can see that he's saying mea culpa, I've got these faults, but he's at least partially justifying them. The naivete when it's transcendental is justified. The aggressive declarations of intention, that's ressentiment, that's bad, but at the same time, it's important to demarcate the new paradigm from the old and to point to a new direction. These are the proclamations or promissory notes. They are in fact essential. They're part of the heuristic core just as much as the positive concepts that are being put into play in the text. You need a heuristic core of directions for further travel along the paths set up, because it's a project, it's a program, it's not a final static completed system. So he takes all that, and he mentions as well the deliberate absence of citation and idle talk, what he supposes to be idle talk. So that's the pure and purest aspect of this text. No idle discussion, but which can make it, as we said, harder because we're not getting the ordinary context of the collective problematic or problem situation that gives sense to his intervention. But then again, we said his intervention is untimely in the sense that it was well constructed, well intended, well timed when it came out in 1985, and it's once again from our point of view in 36 years later, it's once again well timed for our contemporary problematics. So this purity has been one of the keys to its untimely nature, that is to say, its repeating timelessness in different circumstances, in different countries, in different languages, in different times. So he says that all that and more could be considered to be part of what the contemporaries suspect as the unconscious of a work. And here I have a difference with the French. Not to mention what contemporary thinkers suspect to be the unconscious of a work, a suspicion that is treated here as merely a cunning joy that has nothing to do with the seriousness of the project. Okay, so he's saying the word project. It's a project, despite him saying that it's a systematic foundation. It is a systematic foundation, but it's not a system because it's a project. So there's more to come, and we know that there was a lot more to come. It's translated as cunning joy, and cunning does have this sort of negative connotation. It's a type of intelligence that is, I would say, in the interest of the cunning person, but not necessarily against the interests of other people. It's looking after number one. I would say, given the context here, maligne has another sense, was closely related, a malicious joy. So malicious joy is against the interests of the rivals or the others. So the malicious joy of suspicion, that is to say psychoanalytical suspicion, is of no interest to the serious of this project. He'll say, yeah, sure, there may be unconscious determinants. I don't care. You're missing the main point. That's a distraction. So, in fact, I would say that all this is part of the Deleuzian side to a biography of ordinary man. So we said there's this Nietzschean aspect, which is concordant with Deleuze. So the attempts, the paths, the avoiding the paths of transcendence. That was a key goal for Deleuze. The reconciliation of rigour and affect is once again a key concept of Deleuze. And then there's this rejection of the psychoanalytic approach to a work. In fact, that belongs to the world of authorities, and so is rejected and ejected by Laruelle's approach. So after that, he says, and here I suppose he's transvaluing or transvaluating the aggressive declarations of intention. He says, once again, I don't fully agree, although that's good. By contrast, perhaps offence will be taken at the anti-philosophical vivacity of this wager, behind which will be imagined to be some disappointed passion or institutional disgrace. It will be said that this, in fact, is the human or to human side of the researcher. So, here he's admitting to a vivacity, an anti-philosophical vivacity, which goes with the aggressive declarations. it's true over and over again in this book. He hasn't reached his later vocabulary of non-philosophy. He does talk in a favourable way about non-philosophers, and he uses the adjective non-philosophical in a favourable way. But non-philosophy, he only mentions it once and says that it's a fetish. Non-philosophy is a fetish to keep on doing philosophy, even though one claims to have gone beyond it. So that's the meaning he gives to the word, the expression non-philosophy at that moment. So in fact, this second wave is probably composed of two subwaves. There's this wave which is rather not philosophy. He's doing science, not philosophy. And then it sort of eases into non-philosophy, which comes to the fore to designate his way of thinking. And then it will become non-standard philosophy, supposedly because especially I've even seen that especially English speakers were, well, he doesn't say the word, but it's that, were idiots, and they thought the non in non-philosophy was negative. And in fact it is negative. It does mean extension and revision as in non-Euclidean geometry, but it does mean negative in the sense that he's no longer doing philosophy. He doesn't want to do philosophy in the circumscribed sense that he's describing, and he thinks philosophy is a failure, is not rigorous, and is not human. So these are the anti-philosophical vivacities that are contained in this book, and then he'll sublimate and transvalue, because it's an ongoing process apparently, non-philosophy into non-standard philosophy. But we've still got the non, and so later on at the stage of tetralogos he'll call it forced philosophy. So there's no explicit negation in the term or the expression forced philosophy. So we're meant to think that he's finally got out of that tunnel, or he's got out of that particular cavern, because we're composed of caverns within caverns within caverns and sub-caverns and so on. You can't get out of all of them at the same time, even in such a pure book as this one. So he says these mainly psychoanalytical readers or observers might suspect disappointed passion or an institutional disgrace. So I've already talked about that a little. So we're not sure what disappointed passion means. Later on, he talks about a certain Cartesian disappointment. It's a shame. In the English, they translate it as a certain Cartesian deception. So we're not getting the link with disappointed passion, which is just 2 lines above. And the word déception in French can mean deception. And we know that Descartes was talking about, or was deceived, or talked about the many sorts of deception. The traditional philosophy was wrong, and so deceptive. The deceitful demon in French is the malin génie, and so we get the word malin again, which came with the cunning joy, which I said maybe malign in French, in English is too strong. So I said maybe malicious joy. So the deceitful demon that we use to translate the expression in English, in French it's the malicious demon, or the malign demon. So that creates another resonance with what was said before. So we talked about the problem that we could be disappointed in our very passion for philosophy. So he's talking about a disappointed passion. Later, very much later, 33 years later, in Tetralogos, he will talk about at least one, if it's not the principal one, disappointed passion, which was that he had a passion for music, but he was not fully equipped with the talent to have a career in music. So he transposed and transvalued that passion into philosophy, and his ambition was always to create the philosophical equivalent of music. So not to talk about music, to do a philosophy of music. I think not even to have a musical style in the ordinary sense, but to have, by philosophical means, and that transcendental means, to create an opera. So that's his disappointed passion. And in Tetralogos, he says that this passion had to be transvalued. There's also the institutional indignity. So this indignity, once again, it makes me think of Deleuze when he talks about the shame one can feel about being a man. And there's a shame that you can feel with atrocities, but you can feel in ordinary occasions where people are saying things that are just intolerable, that they're perpetrating an idiocy as if it was a philosophical profundity, for example, which is one of the reasons that Deleuze and Guattari say in What is Philosophy, which was published 6 years after this book, that whenever you see people who say, let's discuss a little, you should flee. So that reminds us, this indignity reminds us of the fact that Laruelle has forsworn idle discussion. So he says perhaps one will remember a certain Cartesian disappointment, because Descartes was disappointed with the classical heritage and wanted to go on and create a new philosophy. In French, perhaps in English, perhaps a certain Cartesian deception will also be memorable enough that the intimacy of the drama will be respected rather than overcome either by the weapons of philosophy or those of the institution. So there's this intimate drama which concerns passion and disappointment and indignity, and he's calling on us not to exercise psychoanalytic suspicion or analysis, but to respect and not to try to overcome. I think overcome may be sort of overdoing the meaning of the word. Accabler means to assail, overcome as well, but it's more assail. So he doesn't want, he has anti-philosophical vivacity, and he doesn't want to be assailed at the personal level. That's basically what he's saying. Once again, he's placing the bar on the transcendental plane, and he's saying, I might have flaws and faults, and I may have slipped up a little some of the time, but not much. And you should forget that and concentrate on the transcendental deployment of experiences in this book, and you should be up to that level and not indulge in personal attacks and personal diagnostics. So the anti-Oedipal dimension is quite present, because in anti-Oedipus they constantly talk about the reduction to the intimate drama and reduction to the personalistic level, to personalize, and we see that quite often in debates of all sorts. People will say things, and other people will say, "You're only saying that because you're," and so on, which could have its function, but for Laruelle, that's idle discussion. I mean, he's not dogmatic, so he can't proclaim it as a principle. So we'll say it's idle discussion most of the time. And what he wants is transcendental dialogue. And in the book, he's not refusing dialogue. He's constantly dialoguing with philosophy, although it is a little one-sided. But he's been through philosophy. He has a great knowledge of philosophy. He says he had his breakthrough in 1981. So I forget how old he was. 60? I don't know. So what am I trying to say? You have to respect the idea that when he's talking about philosophy, he knows what he's talking about. I would like to add, at least within the narrow confines of contemporary to him French philosophy and of the German philosophy that irrigated it, and maybe with some other knowledge of other traditions mixed in. So his dialogue with philosophy is in the book, but he would say it's not idle talk, it's not idle discussion. He's not doing a Freud or doing a Nietzsche on the philosophers so much as doing a transcendental analysis and transvaluation and dialogue with the tradition. So he's calling on us to do the same thing, and so to enter into a dialogue at that level with him.